Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history helps you drift into sleep. Tonight, we invite you to sink into a royal tale of quiet strength and world-shifting consequence, the story of a queen history tried to forget, but could never erase. She was born Catalina, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the Catholic monarchs who united Spain and lit the fire of empire. As a child, she witnessed the fall of Granada, the final triumph of the Reconquista, and grew up in a kingdom shaped by faith, ambition, and destiny. But Catalina's greatest legacy would not be forged in Spain. It would unfold across the sea in the cold courts of England. Married first to Prince Arthur and then to his brother, King Henry VIII, Catalina became Queen of England, but not by accident and not without conviction. When Henry, desperate for a male heir, sought to cast her aside and break their sacred vows, she did something no one expected. She said no. She defied the most powerful man in England, and in doing so, she also defied the Pope, the Church, and the crushing weight of royal expectation. Her refusal to step down quietly ignited a spiritual and political firestorm. The result? The Church of England was born. The monarchy was changed forever, and history itself took a different path, all because one woman stood firm in the storm. Tonight we journey back through Catalina's life, from the grandeur of Spanish palaces to the cold isolation of her final days. This is not just a story of love and betrayal. It is the story of faith, resistance, and one queen's quiet revolution. Before we begin, please like and subscribe. It helps more dreamers discover these stories. Now, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the candlelight of history guide you. And let us begin. Catherine of Aragon's earliest days unfolded in a world charged with ambition and uncertainty. Born on December 16, 1485, near Madrid in the Archbishop of Toledo's palace, she was the youngest surviving daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, rulers whose union created a powerful new Spain. Her arrival coincided with a turning point in European history. The same year, Henry Tudor seized the English throne, setting the stage for Catherine's life to intersect with England's future. The Spain of Catherine's childhood was not a tranquil kingdom. Her parents, known throughout Europe as the Catholic monarchs, waged a relentless campaign against the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. Their court was often on the move, shifting from city to city as armies advanced. By the time Catherine was 7, she had witnessed the fall of Granada in 1492, a moment that marked not only the completion of the Reconquista, but also the unification of Spain under Christian rule. For Catherine, the conquest of Granada became more than a historical milestone. It was a defining event that shaped her sense of divine purpose. The pomegranate, symbol of Granada, would later appear on her personal emblem, a quiet tribute to the victory that shaped her family's destiny and her own. Growing up in this environment, Catherine absorbed lessons in faith and duty from the very start. Her parents believed their military victories were proof of God's favor, and they raised their children to see themselves as instruments of a higher mission. Catherine's education reflected this sense of purpose. She studied Latin, theology, literature, music, and arithmetic, and was guided by respected scholars such as the Dominican friars Pasquale de Ampudia and Andres de Morales, as well as the Italian humanist brothers Alessandro and Antonio Gheraldini. Erasmus himself would later praise her learning, noting the depth and breadth of her studies. Catherine was trained not just to be a consort, but to embody the virtues of obedience, piety, and dignity, qualities her mother, Isabella, modelled as a ruler in her own right. Life in the Spanish court brought Catherine both privilege and responsibility. She was surrounded by ceremony and tradition, yet always reminded of her place in a larger political strategy. The royal family's movements followed the rhythm of military campaigns, and Catherine learned to adapt to new surroundings, absorb the customs of each city, and maintain composure under pressure. Even in moments of celebration, such as the grand procession marking the conquest of Granada, there was an undercurrent of expectation. Catherine's presence at these events was not just symbolic. She was being prepared for a future in which every gesture and word would be scrutinized. From a very young age, Catherine understood that her life was not entirely her own. As the youngest surviving daughter, she was a valuable asset in the dynastic chess game of European politics. Her parents began negotiating her marriage when she was only 3 years old, seeking an alliance that would strengthen Spain's position on the continent. By the time she was 6, a formal agreement was reached. Catherine would marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of King Henry VII of England. This match was more than a family affair. It was a diplomatic triumph, intended to unite two powerful kingdoms and reinforce their shared Catholic faith against rivals like France. The prospect of leaving Spain for England must have been both daunting and exhilarating for Catherine. Her studies shifted to include English customs and language, and she learned what would be expected of her as a future queen. Every lesson, every story about her new homeland, was another step toward fulfilling her role. Catherine's upbringing instilled in her a deep sense of duty and a belief that her destiny was shaped by God's will. Her parents reminded her and her siblings that their successes were the result of faith as much as strategy, and this conviction became the foundation of Catherine's character. Amid the grandeur of Spanish palaces and the solemnity of court rituals, Catherine's sense of identity grew stronger. She carried the memory of Granada, the teachings of her mother, and the expectations of her entire country. The pomegranate emblem she adopted was a constant reminder of her roots and the victory her family had achieved. Yet, beneath the surface, there was an awareness that everything could change in an instant. Royal children were often sent abroad to secure alliances, and Catherine knew from an early age that her future lay far from the familiar hills and sunlit courtyards of Spain. As she prepared to leave for England, Catherine faced a world of uncertainty. The climate, the language, and the customs would all be different, and the English court was known for its formality and reserve, so unlike the vibrant life she had known in Spain. Still, Catherine did not hesitate. Her sense of purpose, shaped by years of preparation and the example of her parents, gave her the strength to move forward. She believed her life was part of a divine plan, and she was determined to fulfill her role, whatever challenges might come. Catherine's journey to England marked the end of her Spanish childhood and the beginning of a new chapter. The lessons she had learned, the faith she carried, and the resilience she developed would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. As she set sail for a foreign land, she brought with her not only the hopes of her family, but also the quiet confidence that she was ready to face whatever awaited her. On the 2nd of October 1501, battered by storms, Catherine landed at Plymouth, stepping from her Spanish world into the chilly uncertainty of England. Her arrival was anything but the smooth reception she might have imagined. Delays and confusion marked her first days, as her hosts had not expected her so soon. The unfamiliar climate and language only added to her sense of isolation, but the purpose of her journey remained clear. She was there to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, and seal the alliance that her parents had worked so hard to create. Catherine and Arthur finally met in a carefully orchestrated ceremony, and despite their youth and the awkwardness of their first encounters, accentuated by their different pronunciations of Latin, they pressed forward with the plans set out for them. The wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral on November 14, 1501, was marked by lavish pageantry and a grand banquet. Catherine in her Spanish finery and Arthur, the Tudor heir, stood as living symbols of the union between two kingdoms. The celebrations were designed to impress not only the English court, but also the watching eyes of Europe. That night, the traditional bedding ceremony took place, with attendants joking about the couple's innocence. This moment, seemingly just another pageantry, would later become a point of intense scrutiny, as Catherine's sworn testimony about what happened that night would echo through the rest of her life. After the spectacle of London, Catherine and Arthur travelled to Ludlow Castle, where Arthur was expected to govern the Welsh marches. Life at Ludlow was quieter, marked by routine and a growing sense of duty for both. But their time together was short. Within months, both fell ill, most likely with the sweating sickness that swept through England. Arthur died in April 1502, leaving Catherine a widow at 16. The loss was devastating on a personal level, but also set off a political crisis. The alliance between England and Spain, so carefully negotiated, now hung in the balance. Catherine's future, once so certain, became a question mark. In the aftermath of Arthur's death, Catherine's position grew precarious. She remained at Ludlow for a time, separated from the political centre of London and unsure of her fate. Her parents in Spain, preoccupied with their own troubles, offered little guidance or comfort. The English court, meanwhile, debated what to do with the young widow. The most obvious solution was for Catherine to marry Arthur's younger brother Henry, but church law forbade a man from marrying his brother's widow unless the first marriage had not been consummated. Catherine, steadfast in her account, insisted that her marriage with Arthur had never been completed. Her reputation for honesty and her later sworn testimony at Blackfriars would make this claim a cornerstone of her future. The negotiations for Catherine's second marriage dragged on. King Henry VII hesitated, weighing the political benefits against the risks and costs. Catherine's allowance was often withheld, and her household was reduced, leaving her to live in a manner far below her royal status. She faced these years with quiet strength, relying on the discipline and faith instilled in her from childhood. At times, she was close to poverty, surviving on the loyalty of a few attendants and the hope that her fortunes would change. Despite the uncertainty, Catherine found ways to assert herself. In 1507, she was appointed as the Spanish ambassador to the English court, the first woman to hold such a position in European history. This was not a ceremonial role. Catherine managed diplomatic correspondence, reported to her father, and even negotiated directly with Henry VII. Her intelligence and composure earned her respect, even among those who had doubted her. The skills she developed as ambassador would serve her well in the years ahead, revealing a political acumen that few expected from a foreign princess. For 7 years, Catherine lived in this state of limbo, betrothed, but not married, and unsure if her future lay in England or Spain. The death of her mother, Isabella, in 1504, weakened her position further, as her father's support waned. Yet Catherine did not falter. She endured the indignities of her reduced household, the uncertainty of her prospects, and the shifting alliances of European courts with remarkable dignity. These hardships forged in her a resilience that would become her defining trait. When Henry VII died in 1509, the balance of power shifted. Henry VIII, now king, moved quickly to secure his claim and stabilize the alliance with Spain. He married Catherine soon after his accession, ending her long period of uncertainty. For Henry, the union promised political strength and the hope of a male heir. For Catherine, it was the fulfillment of a destiny shaped by years of waiting and endurance. The early years of their marriage offered hope and the promise of a new era. Catherine brought to her role as queen the lessons she had learned through adversity: patience, resolve, and an unshakable sense of duty. The challenges she had faced in her first years in England had prepared her for the complexities of life at Henry's side. Yet, as the court celebrated this new beginning, the true test of their partnership was only just beginning. The hopes that marked the start of their reign would soon be challenged by forces neither of them could have foreseen. Henry VIII's rise to the throne brought a new sense of hope to England. When he and Catherine were crowned together on Midsummer's Day, June 24, 1509, the country celebrated the promise of a youthful king and queen. Henry was athletic, charming, and eager to be seen as a Renaissance prince. Catherine, admired for her intelligence and dignity, was already respected by the court. Their marriage was more than a political alliance. It was a partnership built on shared interests and real affection. Henry called Catherine his dearest wife and often relied on her advice, especially on matters of religion, education, and politics. Their conversations reflected a meeting of minds. Both were drawn to humanist thought and the latest ideas sweeping across Europe. Catherine's steady presence balanced Henry's restless energy, and together they seemed poised to usher in a new golden age for England. This unity was tested early. In June 1513, Henry left for France. As regent, Catherine outmaneuvered invading Scots at Flodden, sending Henry a blood-stained coat as proof of victory. The victory at Flodden solidified Catherine's reputation as a capable and trusted queen. She managed the kingdom's defences, made key decisions, and rallied the English nobility. Her actions won her admiration and respect, and for a time the royal marriage appeared strong, marked by teamwork, mutual trust, and a shared sense of responsibility. But beneath the surface, private anxieties began to shape their lives. Between 1509 and 1516, Catherine endured 6 pregnancies, but only Mary survived. Each loss deepened Henry's concerns and planted seeds of doubt in their marriage. Catherine's first pregnancy in 1510 ended in a miscarriage. In 1511, she gave birth to a son who died after only a few weeks. A stillbirth followed in 1514. The birth of Mary in 1516 brought much-needed joy, but the court's relief was short-lived. For Henry, the absence of a surviving son became a source of growing frustration. Each failed pregnancy was both a personal heartbreak for Catherine and a public disappointment. The Tudor dynasty's future depended on a male heir, and as the years passed, the pressure on Catherine increased. Catherine devoted herself to Mary's upbringing, determined to raise a daughter who embodied faith, discipline, and learning. Mary was a bright and serious child, and Catherine's influence shaped her deeply. Still, the king's hopes for a son did not fade. By the mid-1520s, Catherine was in her 40s. The likelihood of another child, especially a boy, was fading fast. Henry's anxiety about the succession grew more intense, and the strain began to show in their relationship. Catherine's sense of duty and her unwavering faith convinced her that their marriage was sacred and unbreakable. But Henry's restlessness increased, and the court became a place of whispered doubts and shifting loyalties. It was during this period that Henry's attention began to stray. The court was full of young, ambitious women, but Anne Boleyn stood out. She was clever, determined, and refused to accept the role of mistress. Anne insisted on marriage, and Henry, captivated by her, found himself drawn into a new obsession. Unlike his earlier affairs, this was not a passing fancy. Anne's refusal to yield pushed Henry to consider the unthinkable, ending his marriage to Catherine. Forbes. For Catherine, Henry's growing fascination with Anne was a public humiliation. Still, she maintained her composure, turning to prayer and her faith for strength. She believed her marriage was not just a contract, but a sacred promise, blessed by the Church and unbreakable in the eyes of God. Henry, however, began to see things differently. He became convinced that their lack of a male heir was a sign of divine disfavor. He pointed to a passage from Leviticus, which warned that a man who marries his brother's wife would be childless. Whether this was genuine guilt or a convenient justification, Henry's doubts about the legitimacy of his marriage took root. Henry's advisors, sensing the king's determination, rallied to support his claim that his union with Catherine was invalid. The question of an annulment became more than a personal matter. It was now a political and religious crisis. Henry's frustration grew, and the partnership that had once defined his marriage to Catherine began to unravel. Catherine, however, refused to step aside. She insisted that her marriage to Henry was lawful and that her first marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a claim she had held to unwaveringly for decades. By the late 1520s, the private struggle between Henry and Catherine spilled into public view. The king's efforts to secure an annulment set off a chain reaction that reached the highest levels of church and state. Catherine's refusal to yield forced Henry to confront the limits of his own power. Her steadfastness rooted in her faith and sense of justice, transformed a personal dispute into a test of authority that would involve the Pope, the English clergy, and the future of the nation itself. As the court braced for a confrontation that would play out before all of Europe, Catherine prepared to defend not just her marriage, but her very right to be queen. The next chapter in their story would unfold in a hall filled with nobles, church officials, and courtiers, where the fate of a queen and the shape of an empire would hang in the balance. In 1529, the question of Catherine of Aragon's marriage became the focus of an extraordinary public trial at Blackfriars in London. The room was filled with tension as nobles, clergy, and courtiers gathered to witness a confrontation that would test the foundations of power, faith, and personal conviction. Presiding over the proceedings were Cardinal Wolsey, England's most powerful churchman, and Cardinal Campeggio, sent from Rome to represent the Pope. The stakes were clear. Henry VIII wanted the court to declare his marriage invalid, arguing that his union with Catherine, his late brother's widow, was against divine law. Catherine, however, had no intention of stepping aside quietly. Henry's argument rested on a passage from Leviticus, which warned against marrying a brother's widow, claiming such a marriage would be cursed with childlessness. For Henry, the years of failed pregnancies and the absence of a surviving male heir were not just personal tragedies, they were evidence of God's displeasure. He insisted that his marriage to Catherine was unlawful from the start, but Catherine saw things very differently. She had spent over 20 years as Henry's queen, and she was determined to defend not only her own honor, but the legitimacy of her daughter Mary and the sanctity of her marriage. When Catherine was called to speak, the atmosphere shifted. Instead of addressing the cardinals, she walked directly to Henry, knelt before him, and delivered words that would echo through history. "I was a true maid, I put it to your conscience," she said, reminding him and everyone present that she had come to him as a virgin and had been a faithful wife. Catherine spoke of their years together, of her loyalty and suffering, and of the oaths they had made before God. She did not plead for mercy or appeal to sentiment. Instead, she calmly asserted the truth as she saw it, and challenged Henry to remember the vows they had exchanged. The court listened in silence as Catherine finished. There was a sense that something significant had just taken place. Catherine refused to acknowledge the authority of the court, declaring that only the Pope in Rome could judge her case. With that, she stood, ignored the calls for her to return, and walked out of the hall. Her departure was both an act of defiance and a statement of principle. She had refused to let her fate be decided by those she saw as biased or politically motivated. Catherine's stand at Blackfriars was more than a personal defense. It was a public refusal to yield to pressure from the most powerful man in England. Her composure and clarity in that moment became legendary. She was not simply fighting for her crown. She was defending the legitimacy of her marriage, her daughter's rights, and her own integrity. To many watching, Catherine's actions were a model of courage and conviction. The trial did not end with a verdict. Instead, it became mired in politics. Pope Clement VII, who alone had the authority to rule on the marriage, was trapped by circumstances beyond his control. In 1527, Charles V, Catherine's nephew and the Holy Roman Emperor, had captured Rome and held the Pope under his influence. This made it impossible for Clement to grant Henry's request for an annulment without risking political disaster. The Pope's hesitation only deepened Henry's frustration and sense of betrayal. Henry's determination grew as Catherine's resistance held firm. Unable to obtain a ruling from Rome, Henry began to consider more drastic options. The longer Catherine refused to step aside, the more she became a symbol of opposition, not just to Henry's wishes, but to the king's authority itself. Her refusal to accept the court's decision and her appeal to the Pope forced Henry to confront the limits of his own power. This impasse set in motion a chain of events that would change England forever. Henry, unwilling to accept defeat, broke from the Roman Catholic Church and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This act severed centuries-old ties with Rome and launched the English Reformation. Monasteries were dissolved, religious practices were transformed, and the political landscape shifted in ways no one could have predicted. At the heart of this transformation was Catherine's refusal to surrender her beliefs. Even as the political and religious order began to shift, Catherine remained steadfast. She was increasingly isolated from court, stripped of her title, and separated from her daughter. Yet, she continued to call herself queen and never recognized Anne Boleyn as Henry's lawful wife. Her example inspired those who opposed Henry's reforms, and her name became synonymous with loyalty and faithfulness. For Catherine, her struggle was never just about politics. It was grounded in her sense of justice, her faith, and her love for her daughter. Catherine's defiance at Blackfriars was not the end of her ordeal, but it was the moment that defined her legacy. She had faced down a king, stood firm before the church, and refused to betray her conscience. The consequences of her stand would ripple outward, affecting not only her own life, but the future of England itself. As the dust settled from the trial, and the kingdom began to change, Catherine's fate took a different turn. Her years as queen had come to an end, but her story was not finished. The strength she showed in the face of overwhelming odds would shape the way she was remembered, both in her own time and for generations to come. Exile for Catherine of Aragon began not with a dramatic scene, but with a quiet transfer of power and status. After Henry VIII's break from Rome and his marriage to Anne Boleyn, Catherine was stripped of her title as queen and referred to only as Princess Dowager, a deliberate reminder of her first marriage to Prince Arthur and a title she refused to accept. She was banished from court and sent first to the moor in Hertfordshire, then later to Kimbolton Castle. These moves were not just about removing her from the king's sight. They were meant to isolate her completely, both physically and emotionally. The most painful part of Catherine's exile was the enforced separation from her daughter, Mary. Henry and his advisors feared that if Catherine and Mary were together, they could become a rallying point for opposition, especially with the support of Catherine's nephew, Charles V, and the papacy. The two were kept apart for years, their only contact through letters that were often intercepted or delayed. For Catherine, this separation was a deep and constant source of sorrow. She believed Mary was destined to carry forward her legacy, and being unable to see or guide her was a cruelty she bore with quiet endurance. Despite the hardships, Catherine never relinquished her sense of royal dignity. Even as her household was reduced and her resources tightly controlled, she insisted on being addressed as Queen. She signed her letters, Catherine, the Queen, and corrected anyone who addressed her otherwise. Her refusal to accept the title of Princess Dowager became a form of resistance, a way of asserting her own truth in the face of political pressure. Those who served her in exile remained loyal, seeing in her an unbroken spirit and a model of steadfastness. Catherine's daily life in exile was marked by routine, prayer, and the company of a small, faithful household. She found comfort and strength in her faith, spending hours in devotion each day. For Catherine, her suffering was not meaningless. It was something she could offer up, a way to remain connected to her beliefs and to the traditions she felt Henry had betrayed. She never acknowledged Anne Boleyn as queen, and she spoke out against the legitimacy of Henry's new marriage whenever she could. This stubbornness was not just about personal pride. It was about defending what she saw as the sanctity of marriage and the authority of the church. As the years passed, Catherine's health began to fail. The cold, damp rooms of Kimbolton Castle and the stress of her situation took their toll. Yet she continued to write, to pray, and to maintain the routines of a queen. In January 1536, sensing the end was near, she wrote her final letter to Henry. Dated just before her death, it contained words that revealed the depth of her character. "For my part, I pardon you everything. and I wish to devoutly pray God that he will pardon you also." In these lines, Catherine offered forgiveness, not bitterness, and a prayer for her estranged husband's soul. Even in her last days, she rose above the pain and betrayal, guided by the faith that had shaped her entire life. Catherine died on January 7, 1536, at Kimbolton Castle, after several weeks of illness. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, who had been her advocate and confidant, reported that her heart was found to be black and hideous, suggesting cancer rather than poison as the cause of death. News of her passing was met with formality at court, but little genuine mourning. Henry and Anne Boleyn reportedly showed relief, seeing Catherine's death as the removal of a persistent obstacle. Yet for those who had known her, and for many across England and Europe, her death marked the loss of a woman who had embodied resilience and principle. Her funeral at Peterborough Abbey was a modest affair, stripped of the royal honours due a queen. Henry did not attend, and the ceremony reflected her diminished status in the eyes of the court. The Bishop of Rochester's sermon included the false claim that Catherine had admitted on her deathbed she was not truly Queen of England, a final attempt to rewrite her story and diminish her legacy. But those who remembered her courage and dignity were not swayed by such words. Catherine's influence did not end with her death. Her daughter, Mary, would eventually become Queen Mary I, and one of her first acts was to restore the legitimacy of her mother's marriage. Mary publicly honoured Catherine, ensuring her name was once again spoken in royal circles and her status as queen was recognised. Mary's devotion to Catholicism and her efforts to reconnect England with Rome were shaped by Catherine's example, making her reign a living tribute to her mother's faith and perseverance. Even after her exile, Catherine's refusal to accept injustice and her unwavering sense of purpose continued to shape the course of English history. She became a symbol for those who valued tradition and faith, and her story was retold by generations who saw in her a model of moral courage. The consequences of her stand rippled outward, affecting not only her own family, but the nation itself. Catherine's years in exile, marked by hardship and loss, became the foundation for a legacy that reached far beyond her own lifetime. Her actions and convictions set in motion changes that would transform England, challenging the old order and forcing the country to confront new questions about power, faith, and authority. What began as a personal struggle between a king and his queen would soon become a national crisis, one that would reshape the very fabric of English life. The crisis that followed Catherine of Aragon's refusal to accept an annulment did not stay confined to royal chambers or whispered court intrigue. It became the turning point that forced Henry VIII to take actions that would alter the course of English history. Catherine's unwavering stand left Henry with a stark choice: yield to the authority of the Pope or assert his own supremacy over the English Church. Her defiance led directly to Henry's most radical act, claiming royal supremacy and reshaping the nation's religious identity. At first, Henry tried to frame the dispute as a matter of religious doctrine, focusing on biblical passages and church law. He argued that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, citing Leviticus and claiming their lack of a male heir proved God's disfavor. But beneath the surface, the real issue was power and succession. Henry needed a legitimate male heir to secure the Tudor line, and Catherine's refusal to step aside made that impossible. The Pope's reluctance to grant an annulment, complicated by Catherine's family ties to Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, left Henry with no clear path forward. Frustration grew, and so did the sense that the old order could not give him what he wanted. The breaking point came in 1534 with the passage of the Act of Supremacy. This law declared Henry VIII the supreme head of the Church of England, severing the centuries-old bond between England and the papacy. By making himself the final authority on religious matters in his realm, Henry set a precedent that no English monarch had ever claimed before. The Act of Supremacy was not just a legal maneuver, it was a declaration of independence from Rome and a signal to every subject in England that the king's word now stood above that of the Pope. This change brought immediate and far-reaching consequences. With royal supremacy established, Henry moved quickly to consolidate his new power. The most visible and disruptive step came with the dissolution of the monasteries, which began in 1536 and continued for several years. Monasteries had been central to English life for generations, serving as places of worship, charity, education, and refuge. Their sudden closure meant that countless people lost their livelihoods and sources of support. Lands and wealth that had belonged to the church were seized and redistributed to Henry's supporters, fundamentally shifting the balance of power and wealth in the country. The social safety net that monasteries had provided vanished almost overnight, leaving many communities adrift. As the king's authority over the church grew, so did the influence of reformers who saw an opportunity to reshape religious practice. Thomas Cranmer, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, became a key figure in introducing reforms that edged England away from Catholic tradition. Cranmer's changes in the 1530s, such as allowing the Bible to be read in English and revising church rituals, marked the start of a gradual but unmistakable shift toward Protestant beliefs. These reforms did not sweep the country all at once, but they planted the seeds of religious transformation that would grow in the decades to come. Catherine's role in these events was both immediate and lasting. By refusing to accept the annulment, she forced Henry to act outside the established rules. Without her resistance, it's possible Henry would never have felt compelled to make such a drastic break with Rome. Her steadfastness became the catalyst for an upheaval that no one could have fully predicted. The English Reformation, with all its turbulence and change, can be traced back to the moment Catherine drew her line in the sand. For ordinary people, the impact of these changes was deeply personal. The closure of monasteries meant the loss of familiar institutions that had marked life's milestones and offered help in times of need. The introduction of new religious practices created confusion and division as communities struggled to adapt to unfamiliar rituals and teachings. Some welcomed the changes and the chance to challenge the old order, while others clung to the faith and customs they had always known. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, Catherine's story resonated with many who felt left behind by the new regime. She became a symbol of faithfulness and continuity, someone who had stood for her beliefs even as the world around her shifted. Catherine's influence also extended beyond religion and politics. Her courage in the face of exile, her insistence on her own truth, and her willingness to stand against overwhelming odds inspired admiration and loyalty. She showed that a single act of conviction could ripple outward, shaping events far beyond the intentions of those involved. Her example became part of a larger story about the power of principle and the consequences of standing firm in the face of pressure. The legacy of the crisis sparked by Catherine's defiance is still felt today. The establishment of the Church of England, the redistribution of wealth and power, and the gradual rise of Protestantism all trace their roots to this pivotal moment. Catherine's refusal to yield did not just affect her own life, it forced a nation to redefine itself. The debates and conflicts that followed shaped not only the reigns of Henry and his immediate successors, but also the character and identity of England for centuries. As we step back and consider the scale of these changes, Catherine of Aragon's role becomes clear. Her determination set in motion a series of events that would transform the country's religious and political landscape. The crisis she helped trigger did not simply end with the passing of laws or the closing of monasteries. It continued to echo through generations as England struggled to find its balance between tradition and change. Catherine's story stands as a powerful example of what conviction can achieve, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Her actions remind us that the choices of individuals, especially those made in moments of crisis, can leave a mark on history that endures long after the dust has settled. Though stripped of her crown, Catherine's conviction never wavered. Even in exile, she held fast to her beliefs, choosing principle over comfort and status. Her steadfastness was not about personal gain, but a commitment to truth and moral courage that set her apart from those around her. Catherine's legacy lived on through her daughter Mary, who became queen in 1553 and restored her mother's honour, showing how perseverance can reclaim dignity even after years of hardship. Her courage didn't just shape her fate, it reshaped a nation.